very, very special and exciting for me to be sitting here on a stage in Goa with these three poets. And to explain why I'm saying that, I have to go a little back in time. The beginnings of my own writing as a poet are intimately tied up with Robin, Kynpham, and Desmond. All through the time that I was writing poetry in Shillong, which is roughly from the mid to the late 90s, I was part of a community of poets in Shillong, of whom I think Robin, Kynpham, and Desmond were three of the founding fathers. I'm sorry if that makes you seem older than you are, but I think they were very pivotal in encouraging poetry writing in that city. I think a fourth person was, if for nothing but his enthusiasm, a poet and someone who wrote a lot about poetry, and a teacher of English called Ananya Shankar Guha. And for me, these four were really people to look up to. And apart from the writing, I mean, we talked quite a lot about the writing. We had poetry readings. We were, like I said, there was also the idea of forming a community around poetry. And what did that involve? That involved conversations. It involved bringing out a poetry journal. It involved writing about poetry in a personal way, in a larger sort of critical way. It involved all these things, but I think for me, the most important thing that this community gave me was a sense of how to read poetry.
The discovery, of course, is an ongoing process. You know, we seem to be discovering more new poets, wonderful poets from all over the world. And poets, for example, as Anjum mentioned, from Latin American countries, with whom we can relate, you know. So I think there was some kind of disenchantment with British and American poetry. As someone mentioned, maybe our poems read more like translations. You know, you won't find that kind of verbal sophistication and craftsmanship in our poetry that you would find in the poetry written by poets from Bombay, for example. You know, I bow to their superior craftsmanship and verbal wizardry. But that's the kind of poetry that we write, straight from the heart, or straight to your heart like a cannonball. You know, this is the kind of poetry that we'd like to write. So that's how we began. I don't know if Kynpham in this one.
Kynpham, would you like to talk a little bit about who influenced you as part of this same question? Why am I using two mics? Sorry.
Okay.
Who influenced you? I'm particularly interested because Robin mentioned the Bombay poets. And for me, it can happen when you're growing up in Shillong that you don't think as the rest of India is that interesting or relevant. There is a way that you can easily bypass it. And for me, a very important part of the education of being a poet was through you, Robin, and through other poets, was actually reading other Indian poets, reading Jayanta Mahabharata, reading the Bombay poets, just reading Sahitya Academy's Indian literature, which had so much poetry in translation. So I'm also interested about how the other Indian poets in translation or in English, even though you may not have written in that way, were definitely there as part of your reading and as part of your landscape. So, Kynpham, I would be interested if you would comment on that. What did you see as your relationship to the other Indian poets?
I think I should first go back to the beginning
How
of your
you started,
question.
yeah.
You know, like the rest of them, you know, I'm also a student of English literature. But when I started writing, no one of these writers that I had read ever inspired or influenced me. I mean, when I started writing for the first time, that's because, you know, I started writing when I was in class 9. And I was inspired by, you see, I was living in Shillong in one of those crowded rented tenements, and coming to live in one of these tenements adjacent to my own was a divorcee, a beautiful young woman who had just been abandoned by her husband. I did not understand why such a beautiful woman would be abandoned by anyone, but there she was, And to make the story short, I fell in love with this woman. She must have been 10 years older than me, maybe more. Um, and so, you know, something very strong, very passionate stirred inside me. And in my restlessness, I tried to assuage myself by jotting down a few lines of poetry. And the lines, you know, sang praises about the beauty of this woman. So one day, you know, I was so impressed by the quality of my own poetry that I went to the door of this divorcee late at night. I crawled to her door like a thief and inserted the piece of paper, the piece of poem into her door, um, I ran away. And later I came to know, you know, that she had been looking for the man who had written the poem and who had called her light in the night.
So you will find that, I mean, those of you who would be able to discern it would find that my poetry is interspersed heavily with the colloquial, folk and colloquial nuances of the dialect, which is used, you know, in my ancestral village. So this is something which I've noticed. There are a few things. Well, when I first, it took me about 2 years to actually be accepted by the cluster of villages in those areas, because they are very averse to, you know, they do not, you know, happily welcome strangers in their midst. So it took me about 2 years of negotiating, learning the local dialect and so on, and being accepted there, learning the ways and enduring the very extremely difficult ways. There were no roads.
Could you give an example, of the difficulties?
Yeah, well, having to eat a meal of insects, for instance, you know, something like that. Do you alter meanings in the scribing of words? Perhaps there will be a time when your reading and writing will make sense to mine, and our words will be joined by the same benign shadow. In that conjoined realm, I say, let the words of mouth and words of pen latch together like the starry belts of the eastern sky, bearing the infinite weight of the universe.
Falling on stony ground will wilt without its roots. So that's how the past was. You know, it represents continuous growth.
Do you feel that relationship with your own past, with your community past?
Yes, I do. Especially, this is especially important for me, you know, because I live in a predominantly Christian state, whereas I'm not a Christian. I belong to the indigenous Khasi religion, and it is a religion, it is a culture that is being constantly assaulted by the forces of modernity.